Arrival in Algiers. The salt spray has long since dried on your face, but you can still taste the Mediterranean on your lips as the galley's oars finally fall silent. Perhaps you know this feeling, that moment when motion stops, when the familiar rhythm that has carried you forward suddenly ceases, and you're left suspended between what was and what comes next. It's not unlike those moments in your own journey when the comfortable patterns of your days are interrupted by forces beyond your control. The year is 1575, and the bustling port of Algiers spreads before you like a fever dream. Whitewashed buildings cascade down hillsides toward the harbour, their flat rooftops catching the North African sun. The air thrums with a dozen languages, Arabic flowing like water over stone, Turkish commands barked across the docks, Spanish and Italian voices raised in desperate prayer or bitter argument. The weight of chains around your wrists is nothing compared to the weight of realization settling in your chest. You are no longer who you were yesterday. This is the reality that Marcus Aurelius understood when he wrote about the impermanence of all things. The emperor who commanded legions knew that fortune's wheel turns for everyone, that the merchant becomes the slave, the free man becomes the captive, the certain becomes uncertain in the space between one breath and the next. You've felt this yourself, haven't you? Those moments when everything you've built seems to hang by the thinnest thread. The corsair captain who brought you here moves with casual authority through the crowd. His men handle their human cargo with the efficiency of those who have done this work many times before. There's no cruelty in their movements, but no kindness either, just the mechanical precision of commerce. Your inventory now, to be sorted and valued and sold. But here's what strikes you as you're led through the narrow streets. Algiers is alive in ways that surprise you. This isn't the hellish wasteland you might have imagined. Children dart between the legs of adults, their laughter echoing off stone walls. Merchants hawk their wares in melodic calls that rise and fall like music. The scent of spices and bread and salt air mingles with less pleasant odors, creating something complex and undeniably real. The weight you carry in your own life, those responsibilities that keep you awake at night, the decisions that feel too large for any one person to bear. They prepare you to understand something profound about this moment. When everything familiar is stripped away, what remains? When the structures that defined you crumble, what foundation do you stand on? The holding area where they place you is a courtyard surrounded by high walls. Dozens of other captives sit or pace or stare at nothing, each lost in their own reckoning with this new reality. Some weep quietly, others rage against their bonds. A few seem to have already retreated so far inside themselves that their bodies are merely empty vessels. But in one corner, you notice something different. An older man sits cross-legged on the hard-packed earth, his back straight despite his age, his eyes closed but alert. There's something about his stillness that draws attention, not the emptiness of despair, but the fullness of someone who has found a different way to carry weight. His name, you'll learn, is Hassan, though that wasn't always his name. 20 years ago, he was Giovanni, a Venetian merchant whose ship was taken in these same waters. 20 years of slavery should have broken him. Instead, there's something in his bearing that speaks of hard-won wisdom. You're wondering how, he says without opening his eyes, somehow knowing you're watching him. His voice carries the musical accent of his adopted home, but underneath it, you can still hear the cadences of Italy. How does a man survive this? How does he keep his mind when everything else is taken? This is the question that follows you into every difficult season, isn't it? When the market turns against you, when key people leave, when the vision that seemed so clear becomes clouded with doubt, how do you keep going? How do you maintain your center when the world around you shifts like sand? Hassan opens his eyes and looks directly at you. There was a king once, he begins, his voice taking on the rhythm of someone who has told this story many times. Not a king of armies or treasures, but a king of himself. His name was Abd al-Rahman, and he understood something about power that most rulers never learn. The other captives begin to gather around Hassan as he speaks. This is clearly a ritual, a comfort they've come to depend on. In this place where so much has been taken from them, stories become sustenance. This king, Hassan continues, lost everything not once but many times. His family was slaughtered, his kingdom conquered, his people scattered to the winds. He fled across deserts and seas, hunted by enemies who wanted to erase even the memory of his name. By any reasonable measure, he was finished. A broken man, with nothing left to lose. You know this feeling, don't you? Those moments when what you're building seems impossible, when every door closes, when the very idea of continuing feels like madness. The 2 a.m. thoughts that whisper about failure, about the weight of other people's livelihoods resting on your decisions, about the gap between your vision and your current reality. But here's what Abd al-Rahman understood, Hassan says, his voice growing stronger. He knew the difference between losing your position and losing yourself. He knew that kingdoms can be conquered, but the kingdom within, that belongs to you alone. The sun is beginning to set over Algiers, painting the white walls in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere in the distance, the call to prayer rises from a dozen minarets, a sound both foreign and oddly comforting in its certainty. The day is ending, but Hassan's story is just beginning. When Abd al-Rahman finally reached safety in Al-Andalus, what you call Spain, he had nothing but the clothes on his back and the strength of his will. No army, no treasury, no allies. Just a man with a vision of what could be built from nothing. This is the heart of it, isn't it? This moment when you realize that everything external can be taken, but something essential remains untouchable. The vision, the determination, the quiet knowledge that you can build again. These live in a place that no captor can reach. What he built there, Hassan continues, became one of the great civilizations of the world. Libraries and gardens, poetry and science, tolerance and beauty rising from the ashes of defeat. But it started with a single choice. The choice to see exile not as an ending, but as a beginning. The other captives listen with the intensity of people grasping for hope. Some of them will find it here, in this story of a king who lost everything and built it back better. Others will let despair claim them. But the story itself, the story endures, passed from one person to the next, carrying its quiet message of resilience across centuries. As Hassan pauses to let his words settle, you feel something shifting inside your own chest. The weight you carry, those responsibilities and fears and impossible dreams, they're still there. But somehow they feel different now, not lighter exactly, but more purposeful. The weight of someone who chooses to build rather than merely endure. Tomorrow will bring the slave market, and with it an uncertain future. But tonight, in this courtyard under foreign stars, you're about to hear a story that will change how you think about power, about loss, and about the unbreakable kingdom that exists within every human heart. Hassan settles back against the wall, his eyes already distant with memory. "Let me tell you," he says, "about a palm tree and a poem and the longest journey any man can take, life in the fondouk." The palm tree Hassan speaks of grew in a courtyard much like this one, but half a world away. The poem, well, that came later, born from loss so profound it would have broken lesser men. And the journey? That began with chains, just as yours has. But I'm getting ahead of the story, aren't I? Just as your mind races ahead to tomorrow's challenges when you should be resting. Let me pull you back to that night in Algiers where Hassan's voice carries across the centuries. Dawn arrives with the harsh clang of iron on stone. The overseer's staff strikes the courtyard gates, and with it comes your introduction to the fondouk, the great warehouse that will become your world. You think you understand commerce, don't you? The weight of managing supply chains, the delicate dance of negotiation, the constant calculation of profit and loss. But here, in this maze of stone corridors and vaulted chambers, you'll learn commerce of an entirely different kind. The fondouk is alive with motion. Porters bend under sacks of grain from the fertile valleys beyond the Atlas Mountains. Merchants examine bolts of silk that have traveled the length of the Mediterranean. The air thick with cardamom and cinnamon, with the salt tang of preserved fish, with the earthy smell of hides waiting to be worked. And everywhere, the enslaved. Men and women from a dozen nations, speaking fragments of Spanish, Italian, French, Arabic, Berber tongues you cannot name, each carrying their own invisible weight, their own lost kingdoms. You're assigned to the textile quarter, where the real artistry happens. Here, in chambers lit by high windows, the captured become creators once more. Your hands, so accustomed to keyboards and handshakes, must learn the weight of wool, the texture of cotton, the way silk whispers between your fingers. This is where you meet the weaver. She works at a loom that seems impossibly complex. Hundreds of threads stretched taut, each one part of a pattern only she can see. Her fingers move with the certainty you once felt when building your first business plan, when every decision seemed clear, every thread of logic pulling toward inevitable success. "You're the new one," she says without looking up. Her voice carries the accent of Andalusia, but underneath it something else. The careful control of someone who has learned to guard their words. "They say you were a man of importance before." Before. That word hangs in the air like dust motes in the afternoon light. Before the capture, before the chains, before this strange new world where your former life seems like something that happened to someone else entirely. The weaver's shuttle passes through the warp with practiced precision, back and forth, building something beautiful from individual strands. Importance, she continues, is like morning mist, substantial when you're standing in it, but it burns away quickly enough. You want to protest, don't you? To explain that what you built mattered, that the weight you carried was real, that your decisions affected real people, real lives. But watching her work, you begin to understand something else. Every thread in her loom was once separate, purposeless. Only in the weaving do they become something greater. The days develop their own rhythm. Before dawn, the call to prayer echoes across the city. The muezzin's voice, rising from a dozen minarets, layering over itself like your own thoughts in those sleepless hours. Allahu Akbar, God is greatest. The words wash over the fondouk, over Muslim and Christian alike, a reminder that some things transcend the boundaries we draw around ourselves. You learn to sort wool by grade, to prepare cotton for spinning, to understand the subtle differences that separate valuable goods from mere commodity. Your hands grow rough, your back aches in new places, but something else happens too. The constant mental chatter that once kept you awake, the endless rehearsal of problems and solutions, begins to quiet. There's wisdom in repetitive work, isn't there? In tasks that engage the body while allowing the mind to rest. You think of the meditation apps you downloaded but never used, the mindfulness courses you bookmarked for when things slow down. Here, sorting through baskets of raw cotton, you find something those promised but rarely delivered. Presence. The weaver works beside you, her loom singing its quiet song. Thread by thread, row by row, she builds something that will outlast all of you. You begin to see why Hassan spoke of her, why her story intertwines with Abd al-Rahman's in ways you don't yet understand. "Tell me about your pattern," you ask one afternoon, when the heat makes conversation feel like effort. She pauses, shuttle halfway through its journey. "Every pattern tells a story," she says finally. This one is about a garden that was lost and found again in a different soil." The other workers drift closer when she speaks. There's something about her voice, about the way she chooses her words, that draws people in. You recognize it, don't you? That quality some leaders possess. Not the loudest voice in the room, but the one people lean in to hear. "In Cordoba," she continues, "I had a workshop, 12 looms, 30 workers, orders from as far as Damascus. I thought I was building something permanent." Her laugh holds no bitterness, only the hard-won wisdom of someone who has learned the difference between what we can control and what we cannot. "The morning they came, I was working on a tapestry for the cathedral. Ironic, perhaps. A Muslim woman weaving Christian stories. But beauty." She lets the shuttle fly through the warp. Beauty belongs to no one faith, no one people. Around you, the others nod. The Italian ship captain who now measures grain. The French merchant who hauls water. The Spanish priest who sweeps floors. Each carrying the weight of their former lives, each learning to find meaning in this reduced existence. The muezzin's call rings out again, marking the afternoon prayer. 5 times a day, this reminder that time passes, that each moment is both ending and beginning. You think of your own rituals, the morning coffee, the evening review of metrics, the Sunday planning sessions. How they structured your days, gave shape to time that might otherwise feel shapeless. As evening approaches, the fondouk settles into quieter rhythms. The weaver covers her loom with practiced care, protecting her work from the night air. You help her, learning the proper way to secure the threads, to preserve what has been built so that tomorrow's work can continue. The pattern emerges slowly, she tells you, and you understand she's speaking about more than weaving. What looks like random threads, like chaos, like loss. Sometimes it's just the beginning of something we can't yet see. Tonight, back in the courtyard, Hassan will continue his story. He'll tell you about Abd al-Rahman's first days in exile, about how a king learned to live as a refugee, about the seeds of greatness that can sprout in the most unlikely soil. But for now, you carry water to your sleeping area, your body tired in ways that feel clean, honest. The weight you carry tonight is different, not the crushing pressure of decisions unmade and problems unsolved, but the simple satisfaction of work completed, of threads properly laid, of another day survived and somehow, mysteriously, transformed into something approaching wisdom. Shared skills and whispered hopes. The morning brings with it the familiar rhythm of the fondouk awakening. You find yourself moving with purpose now, no longer the stumbling newcomer of days past. The weaver nods as you approach her loom, and there's something different in her expression today. A curiosity that wasn't there before. Your hands, she says quietly, watching as you help arrange the morning's threads. They know numbers. It's true. Yesterday, without thinking, you had counted the thread groupings aloud. Not in Arabic, but in the merchant's Latin you learned in another life, when spreadsheets were your domain and calculations your daily bread. The weaver had paused then, her shuttle suspended mid-throw, listening. Fibonacci, you whisper now, recognizing the spiral pattern emerging in her latest piece. The mathematical sequence that governs seashells and galaxies alike, woven here into cloth with an artisan's intuitive understanding. Her eyes widen, not with surprise, but with recognition. You know the old learning. In the hours that follow, a different kind of education begins. The weaver speaks in low tones as her hands work, sharing knowledge that bridges worlds. She knows the mathematical principles behind her patterns, learned not from books but from her grandfather, who had studied in the great libraries before they burned. You share what you remember of geometry, of proportion, of the golden ratio that appears in architecture from Cordoba to Constantinople. Knowledge, she murmurs, is the one thing they cannot truly take from us. There's a weight in those words that resonates with something deep in your chest. How many nights have you lain awake, wondering if everything you've built might vanish? How many times have you felt the vertigo of knowing that markets shift? Technologies change, that the empire you're constructing exists on foundations that sometimes feel as fragile as morning mist. But this sharing of understanding, this recognition of patterns both mathematical and human, this feels different, more permanent. As the days pass, you notice other connections forming in the quiet spaces of the fondouk. Hassan appears at your shoulder one evening, speaking softly of trade routes he once knew, of the mathematics of navigation and the poetry of star charts. His knowledge runs deeper than you first suspected. He was not just any merchant, but one who had calculated distances across the Sahara, who had read the night sky like a map. In my homeland, he tells you, we had a saying, the mind is a palace that travels with you. No caravan can carry it away, no storm can destroy it. You think of your own journey here, not just the physical capture and displacement, but the longer path that brought you to leadership in the first place. The late nights spent learning, the skills accumulated through failure and persistence, the hard-won wisdom about human nature and the delicate art of building something larger than yourself. The weaver begins to teach you her more subtle arts. How to embed meaning in pattern, how a particular weave might signal to those who know how to read it. How information travels through cloth the way it once traveled through your networks of emails and encrypted messages. Here, she shows you, her fingers dancing across the loom. This pattern, it tells of a ship expected in 3 days. And this one, she adjusts the tension slightly. This speaks of a door left unlocked in the Eastern Quarter. You realize you're witnessing something remarkable. A communication system as sophisticated as any you've built in the digital realm, but woven from thread and hope and the accumulated wisdom of people who have learned to hide their most precious secrets in plain sight. The whispers begin on a Thursday evening, carried on the salt breeze that drifts in from the harbor. Escape. The word itself seems almost too dangerous to think, let alone speak. But it's there, in the way Hassan's eyes linger on the western walls, in the particular pattern the weaver chooses for her evening work, in the subtle shift in the rhythm of conversations around the courtyard. Not a desperate, poorly planned flight, but something more careful, more considered. You recognize the hallmarks of a well-orchestrated plan, the same attention to detail and timing that you've applied to product launches and market entries in another life. Some knowledge, Hassan tells you one evening, is too dangerous to speak aloud, but it can be shared in other ways. He shows you how to read the evening prayers differently, how certain inflections carry meanings beyond the sacred words, how the arrangement of tools in the workshop might signal safe passage or warn of danger, how even the way bread is broken at the evening meal can convey information to those who know the code. You find yourself thinking of your own teams, the people who depend on your decisions and vision. How many times have you communicated in code, not out of necessity for secrecy, but from the need to maintain hope when the path forward was unclear? How many meetings have you sat through, projecting confidence while privately calculating odds, managing morale while wrestling with uncertainty? There's something familiar in this careful choreography of hidden meaning, the same delicate balance between transparency and discretion that every leader learns to navigate. The same understanding that sometimes hope must be cultivated quietly, nurtured in protected spaces before it can be safely shared. The weaver's latest piece grows more complex each day. To casual observers, it's simply an intricate textile, remarkable for its mathematical precision and aesthetic beauty. But you're learning to read its deeper language, the shipping schedules embedded in its borders, the safe houses mapped in its central medallion, the timing of guard rotations encoded in its color transitions. Beautiful work, comments one of the fonduque's overseers, examining the cloth with genuine admiration. Thank you, the weaver responds with perfect humility, her eyes never betraying the revolutionary mathematics hidden in every thread. That night, as you settle into your sleeping space, you carry with you a different kind of exhaustion. Not the depleting fatigue of isolation and despair, but the productive tiredness that comes from meaningful work, from connection, from the quiet satisfaction of skills being put to purposeful use. You think about the weight you carry in your other life, the responsibility for others' livelihoods, the pressure of decisions that ripple outward in ways you can't always predict, the loneliness of leadership that sometimes feels as isolating as any physical captivity. But here, in this unexpected place, you're learning something new about shared burden, about how knowledge multiplies when it's given away rather than hoarded, about how even in the most constrained circumstances, human ingenuity finds ways to create connection, to build networks of trust and mutual aid. The weaver's shuttle continues its quiet work long into the evening, each pass adding another line to her coded message of hope. Hassan murmurs his evening prayers with particular care tonight, his voice carrying meanings that extend far beyond the sacred words. And you close your eyes knowing that tomorrow will bring new patterns to learn, new connections to forge, new ways to transform constraint into possibility. The weight you carry tonight feels different again, not lighter exactly, but somehow shared, distributed across a network of understanding that grows stronger with each whispered confidence, each coded message, each small act of trust between souls who refuse to surrender their essential humanity. The spice market and rooftop reflections. The dawn brings something unexpected, a loosening of the invisible chains that bind your daily routine. Hassan appears at your side as the morning light filters through the courtyard, his weathered face carrying the hint of something you haven't seen before: anticipation. Today you learn the city, he says simply. The weaver has spoken for you. You've earned trust, and trust here opens doors that iron cannot. The weight you carry shifts as you follow him through passages you've never seen, past workshops humming with different rhythms, different purposes. The fonduque reveals itself to be far larger than you imagined. A small city within the city, connected by arteries of commerce and whispered intelligence that flow like blood through living tissue. And then, the gates open. The assault on your senses is immediate and overwhelming. The spice market of Algiers unfolds before you like a tapestry woven from pure sensation. Mountains of paprika blaze scarlet against burlap sacks. Cinnamon bark curls in fragrant spirals beside pyramids of golden turmeric that seem to capture and hold the Mediterranean sun. The air itself becomes something you can taste. Cardamom and cloves dancing with rose petals and dried mint. Your lungs fill with complexity you'd forgotten existed. For months, your world has been reduced to the simple palette of stone and wool, the honest sense of loom oil and cotton fiber. This explosion of possibility makes you dizzy. Breathe slowly, Hassan murmurs, steadying your elbow. The first taste of freedom, even borrowed freedom, can overwhelm the senses. Merchants call out in Arabic, Turkish, Spanish, languages that blend and separate like streams, converging and dividing. A woman in indigo robes weighs saffron threads with the precision of a jeweler. Children dart between stalls, their laughter cutting through the deeper rhythms of negotiation and trade. You watch Hassan move through this maze with the confidence of long familiarity. He knows which merchant will offer fair measure, which spice seller guards the finest quality behind more common displays. This is intelligence gathering of the most practical kind. But you sense deeper currents flowing beneath these commercial exchanges. A subtle nod here, a particular phrase there, the way certain coins are placed, certain goods selected. The network you've glimpsed in whispered conversations and coded patterns extends far beyond the fondouk's walls. It lives and breathes in this very marketplace, disguised as ordinary commerce. The Romans had a saying, Hassan tells you as you pause beside a fountain where water trickles over worn stone. In vino veritas, in wine truth. But they were wrong. Truth lives not in wine, but in the spaces between words. In the pause before the merchant names his price. In the way a buyer's hand hesitates over particular goods. You're learning to read these spaces, aren't you? The weight you carry has taught you to notice what others miss. The slight tension in a colleague's voice that signals deeper concerns, the way silence can communicate more than the most eloquent presentation. These skills translate here in ways that surprise you. A spice merchant offers you cardamom pods to taste. The flavor explodes across your palate, complex, warming, alive with possibilities. For a moment, you're transported beyond this marketplace, beyond your circumstances, into pure sensation, pure presence. Good? The merchant asks in broken Spanish. Very good, you reply, and mean it. Hassan completes his purchases. Salt, dried herbs, small luxuries that will transform the fondouk's simple meals into something approaching pleasure. But you understand now that these errands serve multiple purposes. Information has been exchanged, connections reinforced. The invisible architecture of resistance maintained through the simple act of buying cumin and coriander. As the afternoon heat builds, Hassan leads you up narrow stairs that cling to the side of an ancient building. Stone steps worn smooth by countless feet, walls that have witnessed centuries of commerce and conversation, conquest and quiet endurance. The rooftop opens before you like a revelation. Algiers spreads below in all directions. White buildings cascading down toward a harbor where ships rest at anchor like sleeping birds. The Mediterranean stretches beyond, blue upon blue, connecting this North African coast to Europe, to the life you knew before everything changed. From here, you can see the fondouk where you now live, its courtyard a small square of shadow and activity. The workshops where the weaver tends her loom, where Hassan shares his quiet wisdom, where dozens of souls like yourself have learned to find purpose within constraint. Tell me, Hassan says, settling onto a low wall with the careful movements of a man who has earned his rest. What do you see? You look again, really look. I see. A city built on layers. Roman stones supporting Moorish arches. Byzantine walls reinforced with Ottoman engineering. Nothing here is simple. Everything builds on what came before. Hassan nods slowly. And what does this teach you about the weight you carry? The question settles into the warm air between you. Below, the call to prayer begins to echo from a dozen minarets, voices weaving together in harmonies that seem to rise from the very stones of the city. That nothing is ever truly lost, you say finally. The Roman engineers who cut these stones, the Moorish craftsmen who carved those arches, their work continues. Their knowledge lives on in new forms. Yes, Hassan breathes, and the thing you're building, the vision that drove you to those long nights, those difficult decisions, that too continues. Perhaps not in the form you originally imagined, but the essential elements, the core of what you were trying to create, that cannot be destroyed. The weight you carry seems to shift again, redistributing itself across your shoulders like a pack adjusted for a longer journey. You think of the weaver transforming her lost workshop into new patterns, new possibilities, of Hassan himself carrying forward the wisdom of Abd al-Rahman across centuries and circumstances. I used to think, you say quietly, that losing control meant losing everything, that if I couldn't direct every outcome, guide every decision, then what I was building would collapse. And now? The muezzin's call continues to weave through the afternoon air, joined by the distant sounds of the marketplace, the harbour, the endless activity of a city that has survived conquest after conquest by adapting, enduring, finding new ways to flourish. Now I think, maybe the strongest structures are the ones that can bend, that can incorporate unexpected elements without breaking. You gesture toward the layered architecture spread before you. Like this city, like the patterns the weaver creates from whatever threads she's given. Hassan's weathered hand comes to rest briefly on your shoulder. The weight you carry tonight will feel different again, not because your circumstances have changed, but because you're learning to see them differently, to find in constraint not the end of possibility, but its transformation. The sun begins its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the white walls of Algiers in shades of gold and amber. Soon you'll return to the fondouk, to the familiar rhythms of evening meal and whispered conversations. But something has shifted in this afternoon of spice-scented air and rooftop revelations. You close your eyes and let the sounds of the city wash over you. The final echoes of the call to prayer, the distant cries of merchants, the eternal whisper of waves against stone. The weight you carry feels not lighter exactly, but somehow more purposeful, as if it's becoming part of a larger architecture, a structure built not just for your own ambitions, but for something that extends far beyond any single vision or dream. Tomorrow will bring new lessons, new patterns to decode, new ways to transform limitation into unexpected strength. But tonight you rest knowing that the essential core of what you're building cannot be captured, cannot be contained. It lives in the spaces between words, in the pause before decisions, in the quiet resilience that turns constraint into wisdom. The legend begins to grow. In the days that follow, something begins to shift in the shadows of the fondouk, something so subtle that even the guards, with their watchful eyes and measured steps, fail to notice at first. It starts with the weaver. You watch her fingers work the loom, and you begin to see what Hassan meant about patterns within patterns. Where once she wove the prescribed designs, now there are variations. A thread pulled slightly tighter here, a color shifted by the smallest degree there. To the casual observer, to the merchant who will eventually purchase the cloth, nothing appears different. But to those who know how to look, to those who understand the language she's creating, each piece tells a story. Every thread has intention, she whispers to you one morning, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic clacking of the looms. Every choice, no matter how small, is still a choice. You begin to understand that this is how legends are born, not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the accumulation of countless small acts of defiance. In the quiet insistence that the human spirit cannot be entirely subdued. You find yourself following her example. When assigned to carry messages through the quarter, you walk a little slower than required. Not slow enough to invite punishment, but slow enough to exchange meaningful glances with others. Slow enough to notice the baker who has begun adding an extra pinch of cinnamon to the bread when the guards aren't watching. Small enough to see the scribe who teaches letters to those who clean around his workspace, using dust on stone tablets that can be quickly swept away. These acts, they ripple outward like stones dropped in still water. The weight you carry in your chest begins to feel different. Not lighter exactly, but transformed. You recognize this feeling from the moments when what you're building in your other life seemed impossible, when the obstacles appeared insurmountable. It's the quiet determination that emerges when you realize that progress isn't always measured in dramatic leaps forward. Sometimes it lives in the space between compliance and resistance. Sometimes it grows in the patient cultivation of hope when hope seems foolish. Hassan notices the changes before you fully understand them yourself. One evening, as the call to prayer echoes across the courtyard, he approaches your workspace with that measured walk of his. The others are beginning to talk, he says quietly, pretending to examine the weaver's latest piece. They speak of small miracles: bread that tastes like home, cloth that carries messages of beauty, work that somehow feels less like burden. You look up from your own hands, realizing that you too have begun to find ways to infuse intention into the most mundane tasks. The way you arrange the completed textiles, the path you choose when moving through the quarter, the rhythm you establish when working alongside others. Is that dangerous, you ask, though you already know the answer carries complexity? Hassan's weathered face creases into something that might be called a smile. All hope is dangerous, he says, but the absence of hope, that is the only true captivity. As the weeks unfold, you begin to notice how stories travel through the fondouk. Not through spoken words. Those are too easily overheard, too easily punished. Instead, they move through glances and gestures, through the way someone arranges their workspace, through the timing of movements and the patterns of collaboration. The lantern light that illuminated your first conversation with Hassan becomes something more. Each evening, as it flickers across the courtyard, it seems to gather the day's small acts of defiance and transform them into something larger. Under its glow, you see others finding ways to maintain dignity, to preserve identity, to nurture the essential parts of themselves that no captivity can truly reach. You think of the leaders you know in your other life, the ones who understand that transformation rarely happens through force alone, the ones who recognize that the most profound changes often begin with individuals choosing to act differently in small ways, day after day, until those choices accumulate into something undeniable. The weaver teaches you to see these patterns everywhere, in the way the baker's apprentice has begun to hum while working, not loudly enough to disturb, but audibly enough to remind others that music still exists. In how the water carrier has started to pause at each station just a moment longer than necessary, creating opportunities for brief exchanges. In the manner that even the cleaning becomes a form of artistry when performed with intention rather than mere compliance. Legends, she tells you one afternoon, her voice carrying the weight of experience, are not about the extraordinary becoming ordinary. They are about ordinary people choosing to remain extraordinary despite circumstances that would reduce them to mere survival. You feel this truth settle into your bones. In your other life, you know the exhaustion of carrying responsibility when the path forward seems unclear. You understand the weight of making decisions that affect others when the stakes feel impossibly high. But here, in this place of constraint, you're learning something about the deepest sources of resilience. The legend that's beginning to grow around these small acts isn't about escape, though escape remains a distant hope. It isn't about rebellion in the dramatic sense, though resistance takes many forms. Instead, it's about the recognition that the human spirit has dimensions that no external force can fully control. You watch Hassan move through his daily routines, and you begin to understand why others speak of him with such quiet reverence. It isn't because he promises easy solutions or dramatic rescues. It's because he demonstrates, through his very presence, that it's possible to maintain dignity and purpose even in circumstances designed to strip both away. The story of Abd al-Rahman that he began to share with you, you're starting to realize it isn't just history. It's instruction. A map for navigating the territory between what is and what might be possible. As you settle into sleep tonight, the lantern's glow casting familiar shadows across the courtyard, you carry with you the day's accumulation of small victories. The weaver's subtle variations, the baker's extra spice, the scribe's patient teaching, your own growing understanding of how to find purpose within constraint. These acts are beginning to weave together into something larger than their individual parts. A story that others will tell, a legend that will outlive the circumstances that gave it birth. A reminder that what you're building, the essential core of it, cannot be diminished by external limitations. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities for these small choices, new chances to demonstrate that leadership sometimes means simply refusing to let circumstances define the boundaries of who you are. But tonight you rest in the knowledge that legends begin exactly this way, with ordinary people choosing to remain extraordinary, one small act at a time. Hack whispers in the dark. The small acts of defiance begin to take on their own rhythm, their own quiet cadence that beats beneath the surface of daily routine. You watch as these gestures multiply, each one carrying the weight of identity preserved against all odds. In the pre-dawn darkness, before the first call to prayer echoes across the city, the baker kneads more than flour and water into his dough. His weathered hands, hands that once shaped loaves in a village outside Valencia, fold memories into every portion, a pinch of cinnamon here, a whisper of cardamom there, spices that shouldn't exist in the standard rations, yet somehow find their way into the morning bread. The aroma that rises from his ovens carries more than sustenance. It carries the scent of kitchens left behind, of feast days and family gatherings, of mothers teaching daughters the precise moment when yeast transforms simple ingredients into something that nourishes both body and spirit. When people bite into that bread at dawn, their eyes close for just a moment longer than hunger requires. In that pause, in that brief suspension of the present, they taste home. The baker knows the risk. Extra spices mean questions. Questions mean scrutiny. Scrutiny means punishment. Yet each morning, his hands reach for those small treasures he's somehow managed to acquire, to preserve, to transform into acts of quiet rebellion that feed more than empty stomachs. The weaver's fingers work with similar purpose, though her defiance speaks in a language only the initiated can read. The patterns she creates, those intricate geometries that seem merely decorative to casual observers, carry encoded messages that map more than physical territory. Woven into the very fabric are the streets of Cordoba, the layout of the Great Library of Baghdad, the trade routes that once connected civilizations across continents. Her loom becomes a cartographer's tool, each thread a line of longitude, each color a landmark preserved in textile memory. The red silk traces the path from the Alhambra to the harbor. The golden thread marks the location of the hidden synagogue where scholars once debated philosophy until dawn. The deep blue, precious and carefully hoarded, outlines the route to freedom that exists not just in geography, but in the preservation of knowledge itself. She teaches this language to others through stolen moments, through fingers brushing against fabric in ways that seem accidental, but carry profound intention. The young woman who sorts the finished textiles learns to read the difference between a pattern that simply decorates and one that preserves the memory of streets she may never walk again. The old man who repairs the looms begins to understand that certain knots, certain tensions in the weaving, spell out names of places that must not be forgotten. The muezzin's call to prayer, that haunting melody that marks the rhythm of days, begins to serve different purposes for different souls. For some, it becomes an unexpected source of comfort, a reminder that even in captivity, there are moments when all activity stops, when the entire city pauses to acknowledge something larger than immediate circumstance. For others, the call awakens memories of church bells, of synagogue chants, of their own traditions that marked time with different melodies but similar reverence. In those 5 daily moments of citywide stillness, they find space to honor their own forms of prayer, their own connections to the divine, spoken silently in languages their captors cannot hear or control. The carpenter, a man whose hands once carved altarpieces for cathedrals, begins to incorporate symbols into his repair work that speak to multiple faiths, a curve in the wood that suggests both Islamic calligraphy and Hebrew letters, a joint that resembles a cross to Christian eyes but reads as something entirely different to others. His tools become instruments of inclusion, creating beauty that honors the diverse spiritual longings of those around him. These acts accumulate like sediment, layer upon layer of small choices that gradually shift the foundation of daily existence. The evening gathering around Hassan's stories becomes something more than entertainment. It becomes a repository, a living archive where the threads of individual resistance weave together into something approaching hope. The shared skill you've discovered, that ability to read between the lines, to communicate in the spaces between words, grows stronger with each passing day. You find yourself contributing to this underground language, adding your own small rebellions to the growing collection. Perhaps it's the way you arrange the tools in the workshop, creating patterns that spell out messages for those who know how to look. Perhaps it's how you distribute the evening rations, ensuring that certain combinations of food reach certain people, carrying flavors that trigger specific memories of home. Perhaps it's simply the way you meet someone's eyes for just a moment longer than necessary, acknowledging their full humanity in a system designed to reduce people to their labor value. The risks are real, always present, always calculating in the background of every choice. Yet something profound happens when people discover that their essential selves, their capacity for creativity and connection and quiet defiance, cannot be legislated away. The external constraints remain. The physical limitations are unchanged, but the internal landscape begins to expand in ways that surprise even those who inhabit it. You begin to understand that what you're witnessing, what you're participating in, mirrors the very challenges of leadership you know so well, the weight you carry in your own life, those moments when circumstances seem to dictate the boundaries of what's possible. They require this same kind of quiet rebellion against limitation. The late-night decisions you make about company culture when no one is watching, the small ways you choose to treat people with dignity even when systems encourage efficiency over humanity, the tiny acts of integrity you perform when cutting corners would be easier. These are your own forms of resistance against forces that would reduce your work to mere transaction. In the growing dusk of another day in the fondouk, as the lanterns begin their nightly ritual of pushing back the darkness, you see how legends truly form. Not in grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but in the accumulation of small choices made by individuals who refuse to let circumstances define the full extent of their humanity. The baker will rise before dawn tomorrow and knead memory into bread. The weaver will encode another street, another route to freedom, into her patterns. The carpenter will carve beauty that speaks to multiple souls. And you will find your own way to contribute to this quiet revolution of preserved identity. The resistance isn't just about escape, though escape remains the ultimate goal. It's about maintaining the capacity to escape, keeping alive the parts of yourself that remember freedom, that can recognize opportunity when it presents itself, that remain capable of building something beautiful even in the most constrained circumstances. Tonight, as sleep begins to claim the fondouk, the small acts of defiance settle into the darkness like stars emerging one by one. Each individual light seems insignificant against the vastness of night, yet together they begin to illuminate pathways that seemed impossible in the harsh light of day. Symbols of hope. You watch as these symbols take root in the most unexpected places, spreading through the fondouk like seeds carried on an invisible wind. The weaver's patterns, once mere decoration, have become a language of their own. Each thread she pulls tells a story. Each knot she ties preserves a memory that might otherwise be lost to the relentless passage of days. In the morning light, you notice how others have begun to read her work differently. The young scribe from Granada traces the geometric designs with his finger, recognizing the mathematical principles his teachers once showed him in manuscripts that no longer exist. The merchant from Fez sees trade routes mapped in silk, pathways between cities that live now only in memory and hope. The baker's bread has become something more than sustenance. Each morning, the aroma carries whispers of home across the courtyard. Cumin and coriander speaking to those who remember markets in Cordoba. Nigella seeds that recall the gardens of Damascus. You watch faces change as people break their bread. See how a simple taste can transport someone beyond these walls for just a moment. Hassan tells you that the baker saves a portion of each day's baking, not for himself, but for the small ritual that has emerged around the courtyard well. At sunset, when the guards retreat to their evening meal, people gather quietly, not to speak of escape or rebellion, but simply to share what they remember. The bread becomes communion, a way of saying that what we were still matters, that what we might become again is worth preserving. The calligraphy lessons have taken on their own significance. What began as the scholar teaching a few interested students has grown into something approaching ceremony. You watch as weathered hands learn to form the flowing script, see how the act of creating beauty becomes its own form of resistance. The scholar speaks of how calligraphy requires perfect presence, how each stroke must be made with complete attention to the moment. When you write, he says quietly, you cannot be thinking of yesterday's losses or tomorrow's fears. The ink demands that you be here, now, fully committed to this single curve, this one perfect letter. You begin to understand that these are not merely activities to pass time, they are acts of preservation. Each pattern the weaver creates holds knowledge that might otherwise disappear. Each spice the baker remembers maintains a connection to traditions that span centuries. Each letter the scholar teaches carries forward the accumulated wisdom of generations. In the evening, when work is done and the fondue settles into its quieter rhythms, stories begin to circulate. Whispered tales that grow in the telling. Legends that transform daily survival into something approaching nobility. You hear fragments as you pass groups gathered in corners. Stories of the weaver who could encode entire maps in a single tapestry. Of the baker whose bread could carry messages across the Mediterranean. Of the scholar whose students learned to write their freedom in invisible ink. These stories are not entirely true, of course, but they carry a truth deeper than mere facts. They speak to something that cannot be captured or contained. The part of human nature that refuses to accept that circumstances define possibility. The part that insists on finding meaning even when meaning seems absent. On creating beauty even when beauty seems pointless. On maintaining hope even when hope seems foolish. Hassan shares one such story as you work together in the textile quarter. He speaks of a previous generation of captives who developed their own form of resistance, not through violence or dramatic escape attempts, but through the patient cultivation of dignity. They understood, he says, his voice barely audible above the sound of looms, that true freedom begins in the mind, that no circumstance can touch what you choose to believe about yourself. You watch this principle at work throughout the fondue. See how people find ways to maintain their sense of purpose even within the most limiting constraints. The weaver approaches her work with the same careful attention she once gave to royal commissions. The baker treats each loaf as if it were being prepared for the most honored guest. The scholar teaches his letters with the same precision he once brought to illuminated manuscripts. These symbols of hope begin to accumulate their own momentum. You notice how new arrivals to the fondue are gradually drawn into these quiet traditions. How the act of participating in something meaningful helps them find their footing in circumstances that initially seem overwhelming. The patterns, the bread, the careful formation of letters all become ways of saying that what you're building matters, that the weight you carry has purpose. That dignity can be maintained even when everything else has been stripped away. As another day fades into the gentle darkness of evening, you understand that you are witnessing something remarkable. Not the dramatic resistance of stories and songs, but the patient, persistent resistance of people who refuse to let circumstances define their worth, who insist on creating meaning, on building something beautiful, on maintaining hope through the simple act of treating each day as if it matters. The symbols they create will outlast their captivity, will be remembered and retold, will inspire others who face their own forms of constraint and limitation. And an enduring legacy, the symbols they create will outlast their captivity, will be remembered and retold, will inspire others who face their own forms of constraint and limitation. And so it was, that the legend of the fondue grew beyond its walls, carried in the memories of those who witnessed it, whispered in the stories of those who lived it, passed down through generations who understood that true freedom cannot be chained. Years passed, decades, and still the story endured. New arrivals would hear whispered tales of the weaver who encoded hope into her patterns, of the baker who kneaded memory into his bread, of the scholar whose beautiful script transformed prison walls into galleries of the human spirit. These stories became more than history. They became instruction, guidance for those who found themselves in their own forms of captivity. The weight you carry tonight, the constraints that seem to define your days, they are not so different from those ancient walls. The pressure to conform, to accept limitations, to believe that circumstances determine destiny. But what the legend of the fondue teaches us is this, that every generation discovers the same eternal truth. That meaning is not given to us by our conditions, it is created by our choices. In boardrooms and late-night strategy sessions, in the quiet moments when you question whether what you're building matters, You face the same choice that echoed through those ancient corridors. Will you let the constraints define you, or will you define yourself within them? Will you accept the patterns others have woven, or will you encode your own vision into the fabric of your days? The storyteller's voice grows softer now, more distant, as if the tale itself is settling into memory. Hassan's words echo across the centuries. Every act of creation is an act of defiance. Every moment of beauty, a declaration that we are more than our circumstances. This wisdom doesn't age, doesn't diminish with time, because it speaks to something unchanging in the human spirit. Picture now the Fonduk courtyard, not as it was in those turbulent years, but as it became in legend. The stones worn smooth by countless footsteps, the walls that once contained now standing as monuments to what cannot be contained. The patterns the weaver created, still visible in the imagination, still teaching their lessons about patience and hope and the power of small acts accumulated over time. Above, the same stars that watched over Abd al-Rahman's kingdom, that witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, that shine tonight over whatever you're building in your own corner of the world. These stars have seen empires crumble and be forgotten, but they have also seen simple acts of human dignity echo across centuries, inspiring people who never knew the names of those who first performed them. This is the true legacy, not the dramatic gestures that fill history books, but the quiet persistence of people who refuse to surrender their humanity, who insist on creating meaning, who understand that every day offers a choice between resignation and resistance. The resistance you practice in your own life, when you choose integrity over expedience, when you build something meaningful rather than merely profitable, when you treat each person you encounter as if they matter. These acts join the great constellation of human dignity that spans across time and space and circumstance. In the deepest part of night, when the weight feels heaviest, remember this: you are part of a story much larger than your immediate struggles, connected to everyone who has ever faced constraint and chosen creation, limitation and chosen love, pressure and chosen purpose. The weaver's patterns live on in your decisions, the baker's bread in your daily acts of nourishment, the scholar's beauty in whatever you create that lifts the human spirit. The legend of the Fonduk reminds us that freedom is not a destination, it is a practice, not a condition granted by circumstances, but a choice made in spite of them. And every time you make that choice, every time you refuse to let difficulty diminish your vision, you add your thread to the great tapestry, your note to the eternal song, your light to the constellation of hope that guides others through their own dark passages. The storyteller's voice fades now, becoming one with the night wind, with the whisper of ancient stones, with the turning of stars overhead. But the story continues. In your choices, in your persistence, in the quiet dignity with which you carry the weight entrusted to you, building something that will outlast the constraints, creating a legacy written not in stone, but in the lives you touch. The hope you kindle, the example you set for those who will face their own walls, their own limitations, their own choice between surrender and the patient, persistent, beautiful resistance of people who refuse to let circumstances define their worth, who understand that every dawn offers another chance to encode meaning into the patterns of their days, to create something beautiful, to add their voice to the eternal story of human dignity that echoes across centuries, across cultures, across the vast constellation of souls who have discovered that true freedom begins and ends and begins again in the unconquerable territory of the human heart.